You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. Many of you enjoyed our first Winter Tales collection, which was published in December 2019, and so 2 years later, we're thrilled to present our second volume. As before, be sure to find a quiet place in which to recline and turn the heating up a notch or two. Chapter times can be found in the video description below. And without further ado, Bitter Gold by B.C. Bridges. The night was cold, and Ivan huddled close to the grate. He looked across the hearth to where the woman sat who was his wife. She was not as old as Ivan, and still held her body erect, but was seldom seen to smile.
"Ivan," she said, "put more wood upon the fire."
He obeyed without speaking, but shook his head and sighed. Wood was scarce when the snow had fallen. The seasons had been unfavorable, and much of the harvest in that part of Siberia had failed. For many in the little village, there was no food. Someone was knocking at the door. The woman took up the candle and crossed the room.
"Who is there?"
she asked. "A friend," answered a voice. "Open the door."
"What do you want?"
demanded the woman. "I seek food and shelter for the night."
"We have no food. Go away."
"But I was told at the village you could give me food. A place on the floor by the fire will do for me. I have come a long way, and I am very tired. I can pay. I have gold." The woman's expression changed.
"Ah, yes, to be sure,"
she said, flinging the door wide and holding the candle low to light the step.
Come in. We are only poor folk, but you are welcome. It is very cold, but we will soon have something hot for you to drink. Do not think it strange that we were at first suspicious. There are many thieves and rogues about these days. One must be careful. Ivan,"
calling over her shoulder,
"build up the fire and put water on to boil. We have a guest. A gentleman has come to stay with us tonight."
She bustled around the room, placing food upon a rough table before the stranger, whose eyes followed her every movement. Ivan aided his wife, casting sidelong glances from time to time at their guest, who was a large man with a heavy beard. The part of his face that showed was darkly tanned, as if from long exposure to the sun, as were his hands, which seemed thick and toughened by much labor. Presently the meal was finished, and the stranger drew a leathern purse from his pocket. "Here," he said, laying coins on the table. "This will pay for what I have eaten. I will give you more in the morning." The woman took the money with many bows and words of gratitude. Turning to the man, she said in a low voice,
"Give him your bed and the thick bearskin for a cover. We must be sure he sleeps soundly."
Ivan led the stranger through a narrow doorway and returned presently. Soon the sound of heavy breathing told the listeners that their guest was asleep. The man and woman spoke in low tones. "He looks very strong," said the man. "Perhaps the first stroke would not be enough."
"It will be easy,"
said the woman.
"He sleeps on his back, and I will stand beside you with the hatchet."
"He is big, and there would be much blood."
"Oh, that is quickly cleaned up. We can put the body out in the snow, and by morning the wolves will have eaten it. We can say he arose and left very early, or that he did not come here at all. He has gold, much gold. I saw it shining in the candlelight."
"I am old and weak," protested the man. "I have not strength to strike the blow. See how my hands tremble."
"I tell you, you are a fool, Ivan,"
hissed the woman angrily.
"Here,
thrusting money in his hand.
take this. Go to the inn and drink. Perhaps that will give you courage. Bah!
She added under her breath.
All men are cowards.
He took the money without answering and left the hut. At the inn, Ivan drank several glasses of strong liquor, one after another, without stopping. "You drink for joy," said old Dmitri, the innkeeper, "because your son has returned?" Ivan stared. "My son?" "Yes," said Dmitri. "He came here and asked if you still lived, then left, speaking of some boyish plan to deceive you for a jest. I did not know him at first, for he has a great beard now, and it is many years since he went away. How well I remember him! He was a good boy, a little headstrong, perhaps, but good at heart. Many times have I carried him on my back through the forest to search for nuts. He had rosy cheeks and laughed all the time. And now he has returned with much gold. He showed it to me, all for his old father and mother. Surely your fortune is good. Ah, if I had such a son! Now I am old, and there is none to care for me. Come, Ivan, drink again, and I will drink with you." Ivan still gaped in dumb amazement. "My son?" he repeated. Suddenly, with a choking cry, he lunged for the door. The thickly fallen snow was above Ivan's knees as he plunged up the hill. He reeled unsteadily as he ran. Once he fell, cutting his hand on a sharp rock, half buried. He did not feel the hurt, but the snow showed deeply crimson. Struggling weakly to his feet, he hurried on, making noises in his throat like a wounded animal. The wind was like a strong man pushing against his chest. His lungs seemed ready to burst, and strange lights flashed before his eyes. At last, he reached the hut. Pushing open the door, he stumbled in. The woman stood by the table, wiping her hands on a dirty rag. She saw him and smiled guiltily.
"Never mind,"
she said.
"It's all done now."
The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and staled anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on, and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again, and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak, and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlour, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and, having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love and, of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travellers who had walked on and on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death. Death! I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart but that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then, folks do get cast away hereabouts from time to time, and what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwolding?" "A good 20 mile, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 mile t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "It ain't at all use," growled he. "He won't let you in. Not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's nought to you," was the unceremonious reply. Well, well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight." You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide, and, still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down, Bay," and he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw, in the little circle of light shed by the lantern, that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity, and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the centre of the floor stood some huge object gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform, with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the muir and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning. The right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay, if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth, and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me.
"I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder."
I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly, and sat down to his own supper, which consisted, primitively, of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said,
"Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?"
"Pray interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forget now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, spectres, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages.
"The world," he said, "grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical sciences, put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool.
He spoke with bitterness, and, having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added, with an altered voice and manner, "I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history." "It is a very sad one," I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer.
"It is a very common one," he replied. "I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me."
He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window.
"It has ceased snowing,"
he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Ceased!" I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. "Oh, if it were only possible! But no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight." "Walk 20 miles tonight?" repeated my host. "What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently. "Of my young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror."
"Where is she?"
"At Dwolding, 20 miles away."
"At Dwolding," he echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles. But are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours?"
"So very, very anxious, that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse."
"Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate," said he, smiling. "The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwolding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one?"
"Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whisky and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of usquebaugh before you start?" I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I had traversed the hall, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand, and his shadow at his feet. I followed, with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears, his eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day, with surprise, how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images, and fragments of splendid reasoning,
in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail of the way."
"This, then, is the old coach road?"
"Aye, 'tis the old coach road."
"And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?"
"Nigh upon 3 mile."
I pulled up my purse, and he became more communicative.
"The road's a fur road enough," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident."
"What accident?"
The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit of road in the whole country."
"Horrible! Were many lives lost?"
"All. 4 were found dead, and t'other 2 died next morning."
"How long is it since this happened?"
"Just 9 year."
"Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night."
"Good night, sir, and thank ye."
Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back by the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary! A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head, and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening, and, to some extent, I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands, and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I was scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I had first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment
I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travellers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbour. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbour, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience, and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mould and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse, in which it had been mouldering away for years, to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in a deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair?" He moved his head slowly, and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural lustre. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back, as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbour. He, too, was looking at me, with the same startling pallor in his face, and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw— oh, heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men, like myself. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you, in half a dozen words, the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocket-book showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and, thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach.
The Polar Vortex by Malcolm Ferguson. Among the effects of the late Leopold Lemming, multimillionaire turned scientist and dabbler, was a small battered old chest containing several hundred yards of wire on which had been recorded sounds, and a 200-page transcript of an experiment. Lemming had made his money in real estate, which is quite another thing from science, and in spite of his considerably advantageous investments in new scientific inventions, most people thought of Lemming as a shrewd businessman and only a dabbler in the sciences, or, as they put it, the pseudosciences. This opinion continued throughout the estate's auction, at the appearance of such fantastic objects as rune-hilted swords, waxen images of notables, volumes of Paracelsus, the Book of the Dead, and Cotton Mather, all copiously annotated in a cryptic shorthand, with now and then a vehement objection bursting into English, as he disagreed with one or another of these. There were quite a number of these objects, some common, some very esoteric indeed, but all apparently appraised as to their validity. Then there were volumes on the sciences, astronomy, mathematics, physics predominantly, all bearing this code of the modern Pepys, whose choice of objects was so strange. The most curious acquisition made from Lemming's effects, however, was the battered old chest, which contained the manuscript in English, the dictaphone wire, and a small sheaf of notes, which turned out to be the casebook of an experiment Lemming had made in connection with his observatory at the South Pole. These effects gave evidence of a shocking ruthlessness, blindly idolatrous to the acquisition of scientific knowledge, revealing a curiously terrible experiment which could be pieced together from the notebook Lemming used and the wire reel. The Casebook of Daniel Imbrifer. 1st of February. I'm opening this notebook with high hopes. I think Daniel Imbrifer will be an excellent subject. Clerk by day, student by night, he strives with the valor of Prometheus. He'll do. And now, 2 years to the day since I laid the cornerstone of the glass-domed observatory at the South Magnetic Pole, I've met him in a bookstore, vastly hungering for knowledge, and for as much as he could not buy both books and food. Just under 6 foot tall, raven-haired, that he was a fathomer of dark pools was reflected in his eyes. I hope to plumb the depths of those pools and stir them into a mad wrath that spews up the long-hidden debris of their deepest abysms. I want to whip up such a tidal frenzy in his mind that all surface craft will be lost, and derelict thoughts be riven from their mud-moored deeps. But not a bit of this eagerness could be seen in my casual introduction, as we both groped for the same book. In a moment he knew me from various news photos and articles. We talked, I feigning interest in several odd volumes, he unfolding forthright views on science and myth alike under my discreet probings, proving with every word to be the man I wanted for my experiment. A noble mind, full of youthful energy, impatient to storm the gates of wisdom. 17th of March. Imbrifer and I sat late in my library, and over the third highball I showed him the model of my Antarctic planetarium. I had mentioned it often. Now I was ready. I explained to him that there was to be a council of scientists there, and cunningly interwove names known to him and names known only to my mind. I spoke with regret of my unsuccessful attempts to get someone who could represent the layman, since all these men had pursued their theory so long that they were blind to all others. A good pupil demands clear expression from his teacher, and often finds the weak places in an exposition, I argued. With such a student, we could inaugurate a series of round-table discussions, of seminars, of papers and paper chases. How could he be anything but impressed by this, and by the model of the sheer glass, double-thick hemisphere in the deserted waste of the Antarctic, whose winter is a perpetual night? I dissembled the model and showed him the subterranean dynamo, the storage passageways, enough devices to ensure the safety of a dozen men for a year at least. I showed him the telescope alongside the observatory, which, even in the model, could be raised cunningly from its garage just as coastal guns are brought into place. And Imbrifer saw that the telescope could fathom the skies, recording on the deep screen before him what it probed, as if on an oversized television screen. It's a delicate machine, yet especially made to withstand cold, with the advantage that in the winter nights of the South Polar region there are a minimum of deflecting heat waves. Imbrifer took it all in, and I've taken him in. He's hooked. I've yet to get him to take the custodianship of the place until the conference starts. Say a month from the time we leave him there, flying away, his eye fixed as a cyclops is on the sky. I have yet to explain to him the apparatus for projecting an artificial skyscraper in cloudy weather. Perhaps I'll leave that until he gets there. But he's a prober, all concerned for the science of the thing, lured to look at the fascinating, and away from my magic-making skullduggery, teasing his mind to reveal its secrets, catching himself in superstitions and intimations of mortality, and then perplexing himself with why, anon playing cat and mouse with a whim, letting it go and catching it again. 29th of March. It is agreed. Daniel Imbrifer will fly with me on the 14th of next month. I promised him the crop's cream of scientists, and so regaled him. He's to represent every man, or his equivalent in the inquiring man of today, at this intellectual Olympiad. While most of this is secret, I have had his picture taken as assisting me in research, and it's appearing in newspapers here and there. For 1 month, I told him yesterday, he is to be the sole caretaker at the Polar Observatory, relieving the 4 men now on duty there. He is to study the earth and the heavens, the vast deeps of space, and the tiny realm of man. I explained that as one goes to a foreign country to learn its language, Here was his opportunity to study astronomy, to contemplate with all the resources of modern science the stars and the space between the stars. But little does he realize, storming the gates of wisdom, that this may be too much, that like no other man on earth, this world will be too little with him. Of course, I've shown him that physically he will be quite safe. Physically, yes, as snug as a bug in a rug. Auxiliary heating equipment, an emergency dynamo, and an oil heating system if these should fail. A veritable anthill of tunnels, stocked with more food than such a student as he was used to, rayed out, dry, cool, and air-conditioned, into the ice and frozen earth below. 14th of April, at the South Pole. The giant plane landed on the rough ice outside, taxiing to within 100 yards of the polished dome, which had kept its perfect sheen under the combined protection of an oil which prevents blown ice particles from forming and piling up, an invisibly fine-veined de-icing system raying throughout the sheer glass dome, and a judicious placing of the observatory at the bottom of a shallow bowl, which is perpetually scooped by the winds themselves, yet is shallow enough to give the observatory an excellent horizon. The 4 caretakers, on shift for a month, greeted us enthusiastically. I have to keep them as much out of Imbrifer's way as I can, and exert all care that they pack their books and cards and magazines and games, with which they pass the time and beat boredom back. I hit on the scheme of opposing such vain frivolities for my student friend with a sanctimonious air that was quite out of my character. 15th of April, at the South Pole, or, to be technical, at the hypothetical magnetic South Pole, diametrically antipodal to the magnetic North Pole. Today I leave Daniel Imbrifer to his studies, to burn the midnight oil in the uninterrupted Antarctic night, and with problems as ponderable as the night is long. He and I checked the observatory's apparatus, its temperature kept evenly at a chilly 58.6 degrees Fahrenheit, its air conditioning functioning perfectly, preventing heat waves from piling up under the dome, but creating a steady, fountain-shaped current of air, and keeping sight of the stars undistorted. And below us purred this giant dynamo with a low, even pulsing, which was barely perceptible. The lighting in the dome has been cut down to 3 shielded stroboscopic lights. One casts a wan light over a study table, another at the head of the bed on a gooseneck to swing over the low bookshelf, the third by the apparatus for raising the telescope. This was the extent of the furniture under the dome, and the smooth, heavy steel floor has only the trapdoor leading to the underground plant in the center. Around this is a steel ring, flush with the floor, which will reveal its purpose to Imbrifer in a short while. I checked its mechanism, as delicate as a watch, and found that when heavy clouds obscure the heavens, the electric eye will release a jetty vapor to fill the empty airspace between the inner and outer layer of glass in the dome. The ring in the floor will become a band of light, projecting on the dome's vapid black an exact replica of the heavens, as they would have appeared as the earth turns. And just as readily, the cunning show gives way to the real one. Perhaps this device will ignite the powder train which will set fire to Imbrifer's brain, until he feels a tottery atlas indeed. This device I set in motion, and yet one more. The dictaphone, whose wires will start with every sound and stop with every silence, catching every stirring above the pounding of the pulses in the brain's turbine. So. Extracts from the Diary of Daniel Imbrifer. 16th of April. At 13:50 hours by my watch, Mr. Lemming and his 4 caretakers left, having instructed me thoroughly regarding the equipment I will need to use here. It is strange that there is no communication with the rest of the world, or any reception of news of any kind. I objected strongly when he started to take the radio out, but he flew into such a rage that I finally let him have his way. He has an outline study program prepared, with questions for me to ponder. Insolvable questions categorically stated, about dwarf stars, variable stars, comets, nebulae, gravitational pulls, orbits, the origin of the Milky Way, and its present direction of movement. The bookcase contains a dozen books on astronomy, celestial navigation, and mathematics, plus a strange typescript volume containing a collection of folklore and mythology concerning man's contemplation of the heavens. Selections from Pliny, Max Muller, Sigmund Freud, Sir James Fraser, Oswald Spengler, Dean Swift, Fiona MacLeod, Andrew Lang, Novalis, and the literature of ancient Egypt and Arabia, all showing man's perplexed fascination with the night sky. But all my scrambling around is but the reflection of my loneliness, for immediately as the green castor and red pollux on the plane's wings grew dim against the less colourful stars, loneliness rushed to my heart and took possession of my marrow. This tiny toadstool at the earth's Ultima Thule was to be my place of vigil. Well, I must stick it out now. If all goes well, I can afford to try a few experiments of my own after all this. 18th of April. The sky being brilliant, I summoned the Sentinel telescope and swept the heavens, the stars crystal clear in the Antarctic cold. Those of higher magnitude delineated as suspended in space, but what caught my eye as I followed the majestic sweep of the Milky Way across the sky was a void, an empty well in the sky, a sudden break in the spate of stars. This hole or blind spot is remarkably situated to catch the eye, being near the zenith in the lower left quadrant of the Southern Cross. Find the Southern Cross, the cynosure of all navigators below the equator, and this void gapes before you. It is the coal sack, gaping utterly devoid of stars from this hemisphere's most conspicuous spot. 20th of April. My calendar and my watch tell me it is the 20th of April, but my irregular hours will soon trample down the barriers between the days, since there's no daylight and dark to distinguish them. I find myself pacing the even surface of the steel floor. I linger over my meals, but the whole eating process can't be protracted over 3/4 of an hour somehow. I now know what the dour-scorched caretaker meant when he got wind of the fact that I was to spend a month here alone. It shouldn't be, mon. A young lad like ye. It's nae good for you to be withouten a roof. You canna keep your skull's cap on withouten a roof. 'Tis agin nature and God. And with that he took 2 quarts of whiskey, and with finger to lips he hid them in amongst the canned food. A little later he was about to give me a pack of cards, but Mr. Lemming interfered. Mr. Lemming is a strange figure, commonplace enough in appearance, yet how he tramples beauty and life underfoot in his search for truth. Doesn't he realize that truth should be cut in chunks man can swallow? That science, unless devoted to the orientation of mankind to this world, rather than to the bedevilment of mankind for your own satisfaction and perhaps even knowledge, is a perversion. Mr. Lemming's damn-the-cost attitude is too big for this world. I thought today that I'd at last be able to turn my thoughts to earth, at least for long enough to get my breath. But I didn't count on the genius of Mr. Lemming, who produced an image of the heavens on the dome of the observatory. It's a clever thing, throwing every detail visible to the naked eye upon the glassed dome. I suppose he'd explain it as, for the guidance of the council, but I see it as an effort to sever my mental associations with the man-sized world and draw me out into the realms of space. How little I realized when I came here. Is it really my imagination, or is Mr. Lemming trying to condition my thoughts? How? Why? I remember a puppet show in which a man suddenly appeared as a fearsome giant after I had become used to the deft, graciously proportioned Lilliputians. Thus our premises of thought are altered, yet we are always human beings, not titans, nor want to be. 22nd of April. I could not bring myself to write anything yesterday. I studied and made notes on the southern constellations, examining the double stars all wound up in each other's fate, the dwarf stars looking what their name implies under the terrific weight of their bodies. I could not help but imagine attributes for the various stars, a childish trick firmly rooted in the mind of man. 23rd of April. I'm still studying books on this world and this universe. I remember of a man studying the phenomenon of sleep for so long and so deeply that he inhibited himself from going to sleep. He murdered sleep and had to seek rest in a sanitarium. 24th of April. After writing the words above, I went to sleep readily enough, but awoke in sudden fright, somehow startled, perhaps by a cramped position. The first thing I saw was that baleful emptiness, the coal sack yawning like an ape's gape in the night, dark in a world of dark. 25th of April. Tired. I had better not write. Brain fag. Sorry, Imbrifer, old boy, but the first person is not well. 26th of April. Today, I took one of the books and went downstairs, but the lighting is bad. I could feel the stars above me if I could not see them. It was worse, as if the fourth dimension were lurking to swallow me into thin air. I had better stand and fight like a man. If I am going to fear anything, I want to find it out before it finds me out. Apparently at this point, the noises transcribed on the wire do not reflect alarming aberrations. An inordinate amount of pacing back and forth restlessly, a good deal of talking to himself, though nothing as fascinating or understandable as the diary. Very little laughter, except for a sardonic chuckle. At one point, Imbrifer took to running around the observatory, but whether from nervousness or from a planned project to exercise cannot be known. 27th of April. Poking around in the below-surface regions, trying to consume as much time as possible making dinner, yet at the same time subconsciously speeding up and teasing myself with my bodings, when I found a covered disc in the center of the floor and set in front of the hatch ladder. I unscrewed the 2 screws that kept the cover in place and found a mariner's compass. I tripped the release on the compass, setting it in motion. The release somehow broke in doing so, but I soon overlooked this as I watched the strange action of the compass. It fluctuated, wobbled, and spun for a moment, and finally settled down to spin slowly but steadily. Deliberately and determinedly it set about to register all points north, around and round and round. I suppose it sounds natural, but it was a possibility I had never anticipated. Apparently set in the center of the building's foundation, it won't budge. It's the only compass here, too. Is this the reaction a compass should make when located as this one is? The Earth's axis seems very real to me, as if it ran directly through the center of this building. I wonder if a plum, suspended free, would swing round instead of back and forth. I wish there were enough space to try it. I've been sitting here musing for 3 hours now. Here is empirical evidence that I am the man in the mulberry bush, and all men grope around me. Here is interpolated the first of the recordings from the wire, following a mad crescendo of laughter. Laugh, damn you, laugh. It will steady your nerves. Oh. Now, let me think this thing through. Here I am, at the imaginary point around which this giant gyroscope whirls. This small compass is cogged to whirl about the same central point as does the Earth, but though concentric, it whirls faster, being somehow the center of a smaller circle. Only at this orbit is the spin registered, since everywhere else it's offline. Even a mile off, the distance absorbs the whirl, though the compass begins to act queerly. The laws of gravitation offset all centrifugal force. Well, they do here for that matter, but there's still all that extra whirl left. No, it can't be. Where is that whiskey the Scotchman left? Here, if I can reach it. I seem to be walking all right on this dizzying disc. If only that damned compass would stop acting like a weathercock in the center of a cyclone. Ah, here it is. Tell me why the stars do shine. Say, that's good. It's a long time since I sang that in church. Tell me why the stars do shine. Tell me why the ivy twines. Tell me why the sky's so blue. How about that ivy business? That's strange. North of the equator it spins counterclockwise, just like a cyclone. South of the equator the vine twines clockwise, just like the cyclone. At the equator the effect is most dissipated. No crises there. But at the center of this little O, this orb, it spirals to beat hell. And that, as Kipling would say if he had been drinking, is why we have no ivy at the poles. It's also why you don't see streamers around the South Pole come May Day. 28th of April. I awoke lying across my bed, feeling rotten, fully dressed. I am not a drinking man, and feel down at the edges. But perhaps it's a good thing. This place is getting me down, and I don't mean because it's down under here either. That's a lot of imaginary nonsense. It is, truly enough, one of the poles, though, and like only one other point in the world, its antipode, its nadir, its opposite. I feel better now. Perhaps I can study again. 29th of April. Today I contemplated the space between the stars, looking first at our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centaurus, and then I found, with difficulty, the external galaxy in, or rather behind, the constellation of Centaurus. This is another Milky Way. This wee haze amounts to somewhere near as much as most of the rest of our horizon's view for size. From Alpha Centaurus, light is supposed to take 4 years and 4 months, dragging its heels at its usual speed in a vacuum getting around to us. 2nd of May. My precarious equilibrium has been maintained, largely by not asking myself too many questions, and by not thinking about anything. As I spun the telescope away from a variable star I was watching, stars of the Milky Way swam across my field of vision as so many motes. Many of them are larger than our sun, and several thousand light-years away. And then the bottom dropped out, as it were, as if this were too much for this mechanical contraption. It registered nothing. Nothing. A blank black. I looked up. Yes, the stars still shone, but the telescope's field was a blank. Fearfully and with moist palms I turned the dial. A star appeared at the lower right corner. I spun the dial away, up and to the left. Another star appeared. Then the troop of the Milky Way, as if the celestial ballet had started afresh. I'm afraid I whimpered at this, and fell all a-tremble like a puppy. I had accidentally stumbled on the coal sack, and it had taken me unawares. There is something about that celestial blind spot that makes me want to cower in a corner. But this damned place is round. 3rd of May. My watch stopped when I slept. I can tell time roughly by the stars, but I might easily become confused and lose track of the days. Then I'd be afraid to reckon up, for fear I'd lose a day or a week, and have it here ahead of me. I wonder if my pulse stopped, or whether it was some baleful influence here. Last night a terrible dream wrought me. A vine twined quickly out of space and seized my head. I awoke, screaming, and right above me was the lurking pit out of which the spiral spun. It seemed ages that I cowered in bed, cursing my cowardice, afraid of reality, afraid of dream. 4th of May, I guess. Relief! Relief! Damn Lemming! Something he hadn't thought of. A straw for me to clutch at as I whirl in the center of this polar maelstrom. An earthly phenomenon. One he hadn't anticipated either. He who ruled out snow and the rushing balm of a frozen death from his little study of this poor student, Daniel Imbrifer. He who created the glassy image of the heavens to taunt me, who exposed me to the gaze of the deeps, to the hypnotic pull of this vastness of space, drawing me out as oil on water, in an element equally foreign and fearsome. The phenomenon sheds more light rather than less. The aurora australis. This earthly phenomenon has helped me get my feet under myself, at least for long enough to learn that my mind is that of a poor earthling and should not seek to soar too far. In this assurance I have won, for though I lose my mind, I have really gained it. Life surges back, and the pulses pace for a moment more sedately. At first the aurora australis marched slowly in crackling white radiance, as if the atmosphere were raining manna. Then in coloured energy, dancing from horizon to horizon, taking in its bounds at a boar's oil leap. Lord, once again to be an awestruck earthling and watch the hound of heaven, the leaping Loki, the frozen lightning, the shattered rainbow, energy snared and transformed by witchery, a Hyperborean Ariel, an impersonalized nervousness which drives out my own. My pen flows evenly, swiftly, as this phenomenon continues, because when it dies down, my energy will begin to charge and leap up. Later. The aurora australis is gone, but my mind is still in the ways of men. Though alone on the night side of the world, I know the rest is there, that the sun greets most men the world around. That work and days go on, I know. That men work at the vast drop forges, at the antiquated ploughs, that they ogle the women and test their strength with other men at games, that they are often cruel, but that there will always and ultimately be beauty and a warming of the heart, and though many are killed, some will see light and humility. Later. Perhaps I can last out the month, though I doubt it. I am afraid to compute the time and date by celestial means. I am afraid that time has stood still, or perhaps has crept at snail's pace, as if the snail had started at the back of my skull-bone, and had not yet lumped up under my hair at the top of my head. But such thoughts spin into the abysms of madness. And yet even unafflicted people use mad concepts, though they no more realize than they do the fact the earth is spinning and time speeding with it, though they see that the sun rises and sets while I do not. This morning I awoke quietly, and kept a blanket over my head until I had my wits about me. Then boldly looked out at the sky sinking into infinity, suspended in infinity. I think I can stand it today, though. I tried to make a deck of cards, but fearing I would become superstitious as luck played tricks with me. I would have embodied luck as an unseen presence behind me, fearfully pointing a skeletal hand at a card. And there is enough behind me that I have to keep driving back mentally. Sometimes obsession rides my back like a twining corpse. I will choose my thoughts carefully today being determined as the period until I grow sufficiently tired to seek rest. I cast about me for something to do, to keep me occupied. In this calm moment I see that it is quite probable that Lemming did, wholly by design, plan to use me as his guinea pig. Since one man has willed that this be so, and since I cannot alter it, I will let this record continue as long as it will to express this emotional disbursement and end either when I'm rescued or as it will. From the wire dictaphone. I am alone on earth. Once there were Adam and Eve, and pinch me. Adam and Eve have gone off and left me here all alone. I make the world go round on course, on time. But what if I should fall asleep and it should stop and the rest of the universe be spinning except the world? There's a good boy. Crank the spit. If I could only really tell why I turn this world around. It's all in your imagination, Danny. It's all in your imagination. Damn that blasphemous compass. I'll break it. That's what I'll do. I'll get something heavy and drop it on it. This chair will do. There, that's better, but... oh, it gapes like an empty socket. What have I done? Now the diary again. Later. Yesterday I broke the compass, but I solved nothing by that. It still goes around in my mind. I was childish, and I am just aggravating myself. I am sorry. It would be better if I left it undamaged. Then I could see that things are as they are and get a foothold on facts that are fast eluding me. The wire record again. Yes, stop whirling. That ape's hairy black arm grasping the world from that ebb and emptiness of the coal sack turned inside out. Stop spinning me swiveling. Too fast. The world grasped as seaweed clenches a clam, but whirling as the ape's arm spins it. Unkinking. No. Grasping hand, pressing palm, sweat, pulled. It's me you want. Wait. I'll stand at the nub's hub. I'll howl it down. Yeah! Notes of Mr. Leopold Lemming. The body of Daniel Imbrifer was found at the foot of his bed, his feet tangled in bedclothes, his skull broken on the steel floor. He had apparently set out to stand astride this mad world. I wonder. Fortunately, I entered first, well expecting such a discovery. The crew of the ship is quite different from the one which took me away 2.5 months ago. Both crews believe I left Imbrifer for only a week, though he anticipated a month's stay only, and no one knows the devices I have here, not all of them, or why. Now, before they come in, I will gather and put aside all the data on Imbrifer. Here comes the pilot. I'll be shocked at my discovery. Within 24 hours, we should leave here. The Thing from the Barrens by Jim Kjelgaard. I, George Mallory, graduate geologist, could only guess about the thing that came from the Barrens. I saw the horrible outrages it committed, but never the thing itself. Pug Davenport saw it. Now, his head literally torn from his body, Pug lies in the cemetery at North City. His should be a world-honored grave. Pug might have saved all humanity, and certainly saved the 500 people who made their homes in North City. But hear the story. I told myself that I did not know why I was staying in North City. Farthest North Metropolis, we called ourselves, after the Blanding Corporation built our city, peopled it, and then abandoned everything when the radium ore petered out. I could have gone when Blanding quit, collected my salary, and taken a job in Russia. But I didn't go, and our so-called metropolis of 500 people did not fold either. Some left, but others drifted in to take their places, and the population remained static. I lived because I had an independent income. Others did whatever there was to do. Pete Gallagher set up his store. Joe Urschel came along with his saloon. A few men did odd jobs, and most of the remaining 300 adult males went into the Barrens to trap. That was a hard life. The trappers would be gone for weeks and sometimes months with no intercourse whatever with other human beings. But they brought in plenty of white foxes, ermine, caribou hides, wolf pelts, fisher, and wolverines. Though I often went into the Barrens to hunt caribou and wolves, I did no trapping. Frankly, I lacked the hardihood to start out with a few dogs and a 3-month supply of grub to spend a 3-month-long night facing the lashing gales and everything else that could roar across the winter-bound Arctic. Then I did not need the money. It was a dull life, but I had never intended to make it a permanent one. I read my books and imported new ones to keep abreast of developments in my own field. But when I told myself that I did not know why I was staying in North City, it was a lie, because I did know. I stayed because of Marcia Davenport. That's right, a girl. Ask me why, and I cannot answer you. I had dined and danced with what supposedly are the most beautiful and charming women in the world, those found in the salons of New York, Paris, Santiago, Moscow, and I was madly in love with the little daughter of a fox trapper, a girl so devoted to her drunken and worthless father that the most she had ever given me was a friendly smile and a kind word. But I could neither help myself nor leave North City without her, and if Pug Davenport had taken his daughter and gone to the North Pole, I would have followed and built my igloo as close to theirs as possible. It was that way. Marcia and Pug had blown into North City with the first settlers Blanding had sent in. Pug was a wizened little man with a crosshatch of red veins hopelessly netting his features. He was supposed to be an explosives expert, but I suspect that back in what must have been a very checkered career, he had been an expert on anything you'd want to name, including safe-blowing and larceny. When Blanding pulled out, Pug stayed in the house they gave him and went in for fox-trapping. Marcia? How can I tell you about her? Does it mean anything to say that she was a girl, almost 20 years old, beautiful, tall and lithe, with raven hair through which shone coppery overtones? That doesn't express it. All I can say is that what happens to maybe one man in a million had happened to me. I knew that I could never go anywhere unless she went with me. To have her as my wife would be the consummation of everything. If I could not have her, to be near her was second choice. But all during the 20 months since they had come to North City, Marcia's time had been given to Pug. She took him home when he was drunk, which was whenever he had any money. She nursed him through his hangovers, and when he was home spent all her time making for him the things he liked. When he was out on the Barrens, she worried about him. That little, drunken, worthless father of hers had woven such a spell about her that she seemed unable to think of another man. But yet she must think of other men. She was young, alive, human. Some day I hoped she would break the shell she had built around herself and let me in. That was the day I lived for. Meanwhile, I had danced with her a few times, and when Pug was out on the Barrens, I could go see her once in a while. That was what kept me hoping. The fox trappers had been out on their lines for 6 weeks now, and the half-light of winter had blanketed North City for 2 when I stepped out of my house into the street. There was not much snow. Farther south they get more of that than we do, and most of what falls here is blown away by the wind. That had been from the east for the past 20 days, and there were deep drifts along the eastern walls of all the houses. I had intended to go down and see Marcia when I dimly made out a dog team lying in front of Joe Urschel's saloon. As soon as I was close enough, I saw that it was Pug Davenport's team. That was a surprise. In spite of his habits, Pug is tough and hard, and usually stays out on the Barrens as long as anybody. This time, I figured, his thirst must have become unbearable. Evidently, he had just blown in, and Marcia didn't know he was here. But she would appreciate somebody's giving him a hand, and I went into Urschel's. Urschel had his own power plant. Every spring, the Nanook, North City supply ship, brought him 20 50-gallon drums of gasoline to run it. I blinked in the unaccustomed glare of electric lights and looked at the bar. 2 of North City's winter residents, Moosehide Allen and Al Pettigrew, were hanging over it. Urschel would have starved if he depended on winter trade. His big killing was made when the fox trappers came back. Furs were currency, and he was getting rich. Now there was a great pile of white fox furs, bigger and silkier than I had ever seen before, on one end of the bar. I stepped up. "What'll you have, George?" Urschel asked. "Make it Scotch." I fingered the drink he poured and looked at the pile of foxes. A white fox is a little thing. Some of them aren't much bigger than cats, but those pelts were nearly wolf-size, and yet definitely they were foxes. Pug Davenport, somewhere out on those lonely Barrens, had found a breed of foxes the like of which man had never seen before. Don't smile at that. Spread a map of the North American continent before you. From Key West, Florida to Point Barrow, Alaska, you cannot find an unnamed place. You can then understand why cartographers and even some explorers have declared the world an open book with no new frontiers. Actually, nothing could be farther from the truth. Even though it takes you only 1/10 of a second to move your pointing finger from one named place to the other, it might take you 100 days to walk between those same places. That's what we had around North City. Men had gone into the Barrens, but not into all of them. Even in thickly populated states, there are still places where no man has set foot. A lot of things that we never dreamed existed are yet going to be found right in our own backyards. I looked at the pelts again, noted their size and texture. Ordinarily, it pays to give strict attention to your own business in North City, but I asked Urschel, "Where'd you get 'em?" "Pug Davenport brought 'em in. Said I should send half the money from down to Marcia, and he'd drink up the rest." "Wow, you should be able to drink until July." Urschel looked at me, his eyes hard. "He will be." "No offense meant," I told him. "Give me another drink." I took the drink he poured and backed against the bar to look around the unlighted back end of the room. Pug Davenport sat at a corner table, the darkest and most inaccessible one he could find, with a bottle of whiskey before him. As I looked, he tilted the bottle to his mouth and drained out a teacupful. I waited a minute. Pug can be ugly when he's drunk. Then took my drink and walked over to him. "Hello, Pug," I said. He looked at me and shrank as far as he could down into his chair, his trembling hand straight out to grasp my sleeve. "George," he said unsteadily. "Sit close to me, George." He pulled a chair around and me down on it. Again he raised the bottle, took a drink that would have floored an ordinary man, and his right hand took a firm grip on my left arm. I frowned. There was something here that should not be. I had known Pug Davenport to be almost anything except afraid. He went farther out on the Barrens than anyone else and laughed at those who dared not go with him. Always he had been ready to face anything. But now, both from the way he gripped my arm and in the way his eyes met mine, I knew that he was terrified. I told myself that he was probably in the first stages of the DTs, but when I moved, he whispered again, "George, don't leave me alone." For a second, I don't know why, I was very disturbed, but I fought for a grip on myself and tried to talk him out of it. "You certainly brought in a wonderful catch of foxes." I tried to be casual. "Where'd you get 'em?" He looked at me, staring as though he hadn't the least idea of what I was talking about, and let his glance rove to the pile of furs on the bar. For a full minute, he didn't say anything. Then he shuddered violently. "It's the duckfoot," he whimpered. "The duckfoot and the stick. You should see what it done to Matt Brazil." "What duckfoot and what stick, and what did it do to Matt Brazil?" Pug stared into space. "I tried to shake it off," he whispered. "I tried to. The trees were all green there, big tall trees. That's where the foxes lived. I tried to shake it off, but it followed me. It caught Matt Brazil, and you should see what it done to him. It will come here." That was nonsense. In the first place, there aren't any trees in the Arctic. In the second place, this talk of a duckfoot and a stick doing something terrible to Matt Brazil, another North City fox trapper, was just the inane ramblings of a trapper who had too much to drink. As for the duckfoot and the stick following Pug to North City, Marcia was needed here. I stood up, put my hand on Pug's shoulder, and shook him. He blinked into drunken attention. "Pug," I said clearly, "sit right where you are. No duckfoot and stick can get you in here. The door's shut." A pathetic expression of hope and relief crossed his eyes. He mumbled something that I did not hear. "I'm going to get Marcia," I said. "We'll keep you safe from the duckfoot and the stick. Don't move until I come back." I pulled my parka about me and went back into the wind-blasted street. Pug's 4 huskies were stretched in their traces, sleeping, and they raised indifferent heads when I came out. I had seen them before, but only now did I notice how thin and worn they were, and the blood that stained the snow beneath their paws. For a moment I looked uneasily at them. Wherever he had come from, Pug had certainly given his dogs a lot of punishment. That was silly. There couldn't be any truth in the wild, disconnected story he had told. Tall green trees, foxes big as wolves, and a duckfoot and a stick that had done something terrible to Matt Brazil. Only the foxes were real, and exactly where had Pug Davenport taken those pelts? Certainly no other man had ever seen foxes like them. Somewhere back in those god-forsaken Barrens, Pug might even have found trees. But the duckfoot and the stick... I broke into a run. The darkness seemed unreal, full of moving things. Deliberately, I slowed to a walk. A man had to keep his head, and there was nothing with which he could not cope as long as he let nothing excite him. Whatever Pug Davenport had seen on the Barrens... Cut it out, I told myself. He didn't see anything. I swerved to Marcia Davenport's lamp-lighted house and knocked on the door. Marcia opened it, and a gust of wind blew sugar-like snow across the kitchen floor. I slipped inside, shut the door behind me, and let my hungry eyes feast on her. Somehow the loveliest pictures my mind ever drew were never quite so lovely as she herself, and always when I was near her, I wondered why she should even think of marrying me or any other man. A god would be a more fitting mate for Marcia Davenport. She smiled. "Hello, George. Take off your parka." I stood against the door, the parka swinging about my knees. For a second I groped for words, wondering how to break gently to Marcia the news that Pug was back and having a real bender up at Urschel's. Common sense came to my rescue. In a good many ways, Marcia was exactly like Pug, not afraid of much and seldom hesitating to tackle anything. "Pug's back," I told her. She nodded, grasping at once everything I meant. "Is he bad?" she asked quietly. "Quite bad. You'd better come." "All right, just a minute." She went into another room, and when she came out, she was wearing the exquisite fawnskin parka that Pug himself had made for her. Marcia smiled at me and grasped my elbow reassuringly. I groped happily beside her, thoroughly ashamed now of my own near panic. Somehow it seemed that nothing could ever go wrong as long as Marcia was near. There was something deep inside her that seemed incapable of being moved or even ruffled by anything from the outside. A quiet strength. Whatever came, Marcia could face and cope with it. And right at that moment, I thought more strongly than ever that this girl beside me represented not only the highest type of womanhood, but the highest of humanity. Together we walked up the street, Marcia bending her head against the wind and holding tight to my elbow to steady herself. We were nearly opposite Urschel's when I had an almost irresistible impulse to cross to the other side of the street. There seemed to be something over there overwhelmingly magnetic, something that I could not see but only feel. Marcia was one step ahead of me, pulling me by the arm and looking questioningly up into my face. "Come on," she made herself heard above the steady roar of the wind. "I must go over there." I took another step forward and stopped in my tracks. Deliberately, forcefully fighting some mighty summons that pulled me forward, I took 2 steps backward, and the pressure lessened slightly. A cold hand seemed to be stroking my spine, a clammy breath pouring down my neck. I recognized those symptoms as the awakening of fear, terror such as that which was reflected so plainly in Pug Davenport's face. I tried to summon reason to my aid, but all I could be sure of was that, though I did not know what lay on the other side of the street, I did know that it was something to be very much afraid of. "Come on," I shouted. "Pug's in the saloon." "But I must go across the street." "Come on," I screamed. Fighting for every inch, doing my utmost to resist the powerful impulse that said I must cross the street. I half dragged her toward the saloon. When we had gone 10 feet farther, we seemed to pass out of the orbit of whatever had tried to influence us. So strong had been my pressure on Marcia's arm that immediately we both stumbled into the snow. We arose and brushed ourselves off. Marcia, puzzled, turned around. "I don't know why," she said, "but I had the strangest feeling back there that I must cross the street." "Nonsense," I told her. "Come on." We reached the saloon. Joe Urschel had no sign in front of his establishment, but he did keep an electric fan turned on the window before the bar in winter, so that frost would not cloud it and passers-by could readily see a place of refreshment. I glanced up at that window to see the faces of Al Pettigrew and Moose-eyed Allen plastered against it. Their eyes were staring, their mouths agape. Plainly, they had had some terrific surprise or shock. Careful to swing Marcia the other way when we entered, I pointed to the back end of the room. "Pug's there," I said. She hurried back, and I approached the two men who were staring out the window. "What's wrong?" I asked. Urschel," Al Pettigrew ejaculated. "What's the matter with Urschel?" He floated away." "What?" "That's right," Moosehide said. "He was going over to Pete Gallagher's for a set of hinges, but as soon as he got across the street, he turned and went down it right to that little black stick laying there. He stood there a minute or more, rocking back and forth and like to fall. Then he floated away. His legs was 2 feet off the ground." "You're crazy." "George, I ain't crazy and I ain't drunk," Moosehide said angrily. "Urschel's parka was wrinkled, like a rabbit's fur when a wolf's hauling it. Nothing carried him. He floated." Something seemed to pervade the room, a cold and fear-inspiring presence that had no shape or form, but yet had definite being. I turned around to see Marcia bent over her father, stroking his temple with her hand, and swing the bottle of whiskey behind her. Pug groped for it like a pleading child, and Marcia permitted him a short drink. Pug fell across the table, hopelessly drunk, and Marcia sat down opposite him. I walked back. "How is he?" "He'll be all right, George." Marcia smiled at me, and I felt weak all over. "Did he tell you anything?" "He had some story about a duck foot and a stick, and said that I must keep away from the stick or I'd never get away. I think he's more bushed out than drunk." "Yes, that's it," I agreed. "He's bushed out." That's a term we apply to anybody who's been out in the Barrens too long and has gone a little crazy as a consequence. Association with others generally fixes them up, but I knew that Pug Davenport was not bushed out. And now I knew also that wherever he had caught those foxes, he had also met some unreal, inhuman thing about which the whiskey that fogged his brain prevented his telling us. Doubtless the surprise had been mutual, but whatever the monster was, it had followed Pug back to North City and was preying on human beings. I walked to the front of the saloon and looked thoughtfully at Urschel's 30-06 hanging on a rack of caribou horns over the bar. Al Pettigrew sidled down to me. What do you suppose it is, Doc?" he asked. "Nothing at all, Al. By the way, what became of Pug's dog team?" "They took off down the street, sled and all, howling like banshees." "Doc, there's something out there." "Nonsense," I snapped, anything to avoid a panic. "What could be out there?" "You ain't fooling me," Al said suddenly. "I seen it." "What did you see?" "Nothing." "There you are. Don't go starting crazy rumors. I'm going out there." "I'm staying here," Al mumbled. "Keep the door locked if you're afraid." "I aim to." "I'll go with you," Moosehide offered. "No thanks, you needn't." I took Urschel's big 30-06 from the rack and stepped out on the porch. My intention was to stand there and blast the stick with a soft-nosed bullet from the gun. But when I looked, the stick was not there, nor was there any indication of the powerful force that had tried to drag Marcia and myself across the street. Carefully, The gun leveled, I walked to where the stick had been. A strange, musty odor, vaguely like that of an aroused ermine, pervaded the air. Slowly, a step at a time, I went forward. The snow was blowing down the street, a fine mist of hard flakes, but it had blown over the place where the stick had lain, and I stopped short. Just ahead of me were half a dozen long, triangular tracks, almost exactly like those that might be left by a duck walking in the mud. But these tracks were longer than my own and proportionately wide. I gasped and raised the rifle for something to shoot at, but there was nothing, only the musty odor and the half-dozen tracks that were lost in snow-blown nothingness. Slowly I turned around, saw Sweet Thomas's daughter step out of her house at the end of the street. A slim girl, with her father's coloring and her mother's patient acceptance of whatever came. Lorna turned suddenly and walked to the other side of the street. She stopped short, swaying back and forth, coming dangerously near falling, but always rising again. It was then that I saw the black stick directly between her feet. I yelled and ran as fast as I could, but before I was able to cover half the distance, I saw Lorna Thomas rise in the air. Her parka was wrinkled, as though something had hold of her there. The little black stick was on the other side, floating through the air about 3 feet from the ground. I flung myself to one knee and leveled the rifle, but at once the futility of my own position became apparent. There was nothing to shoot at, nothing except the dangling girl and the little black stick. I sighted squarely between them and pressed the trigger. A hollow, chuckling sound rose high above the seething wind and floated back to me. Whatever carried Lorna Thomas broke into a run so swift that I was unable to keep them in sight. I shot again and again and ran as fast as I could, but all I found was the line of huge duck tracks that again faded into wind-blown snow. I was terribly shaken when I got back to the saloon. For a few seconds, wild hysteria threatened. I grabbed a bottle, took a long pull, and slammed the bottle down on the bar. Al Pettigrew sidled up to me. "I told you," he leered. "There is something out there, ain't there?" That, more than anything else, sobered me. Al Pettigrew was the sort of nameless spawn, product of a father who had never seen him and a mother who had never wanted him, that you'll find in the North or anywhere else. He had a weak and flabby face in which abject terror lived. I, product of a high-class home and the finest scientific training man can provide, was supposed to be just a little better than that. "Yes," I snapped. "There is something. Now shut up." Again, I tried to bring reason to my aid, calling up and rejecting every scientific rule and theorem I had ever heard of, and inventing a few on the spot. But nothing applied. There was no precedent for this. All I knew was that a monster had come among us, a monster with a trap that held people helpless. The trap was easier to figure out. Doubtless it was some sort of metal with a very strong magnetic attraction for living flesh. Neogluents had properties similar to that, and probably this was some variety of such a metal. The creature that bore it must have form and substance, but was of a pigmentation that could not be discerned by the human eye. Certainly every resident of North City was doomed, unless we could find a way to stop it. But how can you take action against that which you cannot see? Now that the thing had discovered human haunts, when it was finished with North City, it had only to go south. Then I walked back to where Marcia was still sitting beside the drunken pug. Now the Arctic day had changed to the deeper gloom of night, and the lights glowed brightly. Marcia had folded her parka into a pillow, placed it under Pug's reclining head. Pug began to snore. "Is he all right?" I asked. Marcia smiled, and again I felt that curious weakness. I would have licked her boots for her any time, and when she smiled I would have cut off my own arm if she'd asked me to. "He's all right," she said. "Let him rest. I don't think he slept in the past 2 weeks. Okay, I tried to sound casual. Let him spend the night in his chair. But hadn't you better lie down? There's a cot in the back room. No, thank you. She smiled again. I'll sit with him. I'm really used to it, George. Good enough. I returned to the front of the saloon, for the first time thankful that this girl had been so engrossed with her sick father that she'd scarcely noticed anything else. Al and Moosehide looked uneasily at me as I laid the 30-06 across my knees and pulled a chair in front of the door. If anything came in that door, I determined it was going to cross my dead body before it got to the girl in back. Ain't you taking this a mite serious? Moosehide demanded. Lie down, I said. Try to get some sleep. We've a job to do in the morning. Well, I suppose it's all right if you say so. All night I kept vigil before the door, the cocked rifle across my lap. It seemed unreal, almost ridiculous. I, George Mallory, waiting with a rifle across my lap for something that I could not see when it came. As the slow hours dragged by, it seemed sillier than ever, and all my thoughts of last night even more silly. No, there had to be some more reasonable explanation of everything. The thin grey daylight crept upon us, and I think that is the time when I dozed off. I was awakened by a rush of cold air in the face, and jumped up. Moosehide sat on the bar, nonchalantly swinging his legs. I looked toward the back end of the saloon, saw Pug still sprawled across his table. Where's Marcia? I demanded. Why, she said she was going to take and get Pug some hot victuals, Moosehide drawled. When did she go? Maybe 2 minutes past. I sprang to the door and looked out, just in time to see Marcia Davenport across the street, standing directly over the little black stick. She bent forward until her head almost brushed the snow, and straightened. I gasped, took one step toward her, but even as I did, I saw her lifted into the air and begin to float away. The little black stick floated beside her. I was ice cold. If Marcia Davenport was not alive in it, I knew that the world would offer no more inducement for me to stay alive. But yet I did not run after her. I was thinking more completely and swiftly than I had ever thought before. I raced to the back of the room and slapped Pug Davenport across the cheek. He mumbled and shifted his head to the other arm. I slapped him again and again, and when slapping did no good, poured a bucket of cold water over his head. Pug awoke slowly and blinked at me. Pug, I screamed. Listen, the duckfoot and the stick. They have taken Marcia. Never before have I seen so swift a change in any man. Pug leaped erect. There was no trace of fear in him now, no hesitation, and at that moment I was very proud to be a human being. This little derelict had come in from the Barrens, terrified by something that had taken place out there. But when the same thing threatened his daughter, Pug could forget his own fear to go to her aid. He snatched the 30-06 from my hands and raced out the door. Though my legs are longer than his, it was very hard just to keep up. Again, as soon as we got outside, there was an aura of ermine musk. A hollow exclamation, a parody of that which might come from a human hunter who has just bagged an especially fine head of game, seemed to linger in the air. And there were the duck tracks, huge triangular marks in the snow. If I breathed any sort of prayer, it was one of thanksgiving that there was no blowing snow this morning to cover them. We raced out of town into the Barrens, stopping where the thing had stepped, running as hard as we could. And it was a half-mile away, almost in North City's backyard, that we came upon the snowbank. Something huge and powerful had piled that snow, and I looked with glazed eyes upon the things that were hanging from it. The skins of Matt Braziel, Joe Urschel, Lorna Thomas, stretched on the snow as we would stretch bearskins. The frozen, nude carcasses were cast haphazardly into the snow before it. I gasped. a trapper that sought the skins of human beings just as we sought those of foxes. I saw Marcia. She was hanging, head down, from the snowbank. The black stick on top of the bank at her feet seemed to be holding her up. There was absolutely no evidence of anything else, yet I knew something was there. From Pug Davenport's throat there rolled a hoarse, terrible, snarling animal cry. He threw himself down on one knee and leveled the rifle. I could still see nothing, but he took a steady aim. He pressed the trigger. The rifle blasted. At the same time, a fine spray erupted from the snowbank. I saw Marcia slide from it, crawl a little way through the snow, and get up to run toward me. More snow flew. There was a great threshing, as though up there near the bank some mighty animal was in its death throes. Pug shot again, and again. A wild scream split the air. I saw a line of duck tracks coming toward us, and Pug shot again. He clubbed the rifle and raced forward to give battle to whatever opposed him. A huge bloodstain spread on the snow. I heard Pug gasp, saw him borne backwards on the snow. His throat seemed of its own volition to be constricting. His eyes bulged, and horrible, gasping breath sputtered from his open mouth. I sprang forward, receiving a mighty blow that sent me reeling back. When I had recovered, Pug Davenport lay quietly on the snow. The line of duck tracks, marked frequently by huge splashes of blood, was wobbling across the Barrens. I saw them reach the Sheep River, and another terrible scream floated back as the ice parted and the river's freezing waters opened to receive the thing. When I looked for the little black stick, it was nowhere to be seen. Marcia was coming toward me, like one awakening from a dream. She looked down at Pug, and I saw the agony that crossed her eyes. Just as swiftly, I saw her conquer it. She shook her head. "What happened?" she asked. "I left Urschel's, and that's the last I remember." I stared past her, fascinated by the black, gaping hole in the river where the thing had gone down. With an effort, I tore my eyes away from it, looked back at Marcia. Strength returned, and with it came sense. I looked straight into her eyes, anything to keep her from turning her head to see what was left of the 3 human beings trapped by the thing. I began, and stopped. "Marcia, when grief is gone, let pride replace it. North City lives because Pug Davenport died." I dared not continue. To blurt out the truth and have this girl, who to me meant more than anything else on earth, question my own sanity. At the moment, I questioned it myself. But not after Marcia walked up to me, buried her face in my chest, and started to cry. Then I knew that at last Marcia Davenport had given herself to me, that happiness and delight would spring out of the seeds planted by death and terror. I looked once more at the tracks and the great blood splashes in the snow. The wind would cover them. The Sheep River did not give up its dead. As I gathered Marcia a little closer to me, I looked down at the face of her father. For the first time, it seemed a peaceful and a happy face. And I blessed the thought that had bade me wake Pug Davenport up and set him out to rescue his daughter. The thing was of no color that normal eyes could see, but Pug's eyes were the only ones in North City that did not react normally. Of all the men who had ever been there, he was the only one who was totally colorblind. The Silver Knife by Ralph Allen Lang. When Ross Nagel returned in less than a fortnight from his first manhunt in the uniform of a Northwest mounted policeman, it was a matter of surprise to all who witnessed his return to barracks. It was not that anyone doubted his ability, for he came to the Mounties with an enviable service record in His Majesty's troops in the Far East. The surprise was due to the fact that he had been assigned to the trail of Wolf Dahlgren, a veritable wolf of the north, whose familiar ground constituted no less than 1,000 square miles of frozen waste. Still more surprise was the post commander when Nagel, in making his report, laid before him a package containing 2 curious articles. The first of these was well calculated to inspire the astonishment with which the inspector regarded it. It was a knife of falchion shape, with a wicked curve at the point that suggested the purpose for which it had originally been made, a sacrificial knife. In the eyes of the inspector, this impression was further confirmed by the material of which it was made, beaten silver, and by the pair of great twin rubies that ornamented the hilt. He had once seen a knife almost exactly similar to it while attached as guard to an expedition excavating the ruins of an ancient temple of Dagon. But what could such a knife, with its priceless inset gems, be doing here in the Arctic wastes of North America? Only one explanation presented itself to the puzzled mind of the inspector, that it had been brought by an immigrating old-world tribe in some dim period of history when the continents were still connected by a strip of land. A remnant of this tribe might conceivably still exist in the unexplored regions of the north, the sacred knife having been handed down from generation to generation. How had Wolf Dahlgren gained possession of it while under pursuit by the Mounties on a murder charge? He turned his attention to the other article on the desk, a small, leather-bound notebook, in hopes that it might furnish an explanation. It was in good condition, except for bloodstains on the cover, legibly written, and the inspector leaned back to read. The first entry was dated 2 weeks previously. December 3rd. With this entry I begin another diary, one of a long series, written to be destroyed, that have solaced the loneliness of 3 years spent on Arctic trails. It is lonely here in camp tonight, with the nearest white settlement 200 miles away, and a hard day's trailing from the native village where I passed the last week. If luck stays with me, this will be my last trek through this bitter, accursed country, and luck at last is coming my way. After 3 years of freezing, starving, and murdering miserable creatures for contemptible amounts, luck puts me in possession of a treasure more valuable than any gold mine in the north. The simple Indian fools who use the silver knife in their sacrificial service could have no idea of the value of the great rubies in its hilt. To them, it is merely a religious relic handed down from long-forgotten ancestors. To me, it is freedom, life, luxury, the silver key of desire. It is right and just that I should have the knife, who have so much better use for it than any old sachem ever put it to. They will not have missed it until twilight tonight, and no Indians will cover as much trail in 2 days as the one I have left behind me today. In less than 2 weeks, I will hit the seacoast, then for a ship to the States, and the Mounties can have their north. December 4th. Another good day's trailing, bettering perhaps the distance made yesterday. Nothing of interest has occurred, and I have seen no living thing except a skulking timber wolf. It is remarkable in that it is the largest I have ever seen, a great, shaggy brute standing inches higher than any of my huskies, and it seems to be following me. Doubtless it is beginning to feel the pinch of winter hunger. December 5th. An astounding thing occurred last night, unparalleled in all of my experience in the north. An attack by a wolf or wolves on a camp protected by an open fire. It was well after midnight, and due to the fact that I was sleeping more soundly than usual, the fire had subsided almost into a bed of coals when I was jarred awake by a sharp yelp from the dogs, followed by the snarling fury of a fight. It could not be called a fight either, for the wolf or wolves were gone again into the night as swiftly as they had come, and I had only a brief glimpse of one shaggy giant as he faded into the obscurity of the darkness. But brief as the engagement was, its effect was devastating to my team, the lead dog having been literally torn to ribbons and another slashed on the shoulder. As a consequence, I was able to make but poor time today, and I had trouble constantly with the dogs, so demoralized is their condition. What puzzles me is that the attackers seem to make no effort to obtain food, but I suppose that my awakening frightened them away. I have seen the lone wolf several times today, dogging my trail at an uncomfortably close distance. On one occasion, I was close enough to see his devilish fangs as he stood and snarled his hatred. 2 clear shots I had at him before he retreated, and I am unable to explain how I could have missed him. I have seen no other wolves at any time, and am almost forced to believe that it was he alone who made the attack last night, although it seems impossible that one wolf could wreak such havoc. Tonight, I will keep a sharp watch to prevent a repetition of it. December 6th. The wolf was back last night, and, despite all of my precautions, took toll of another of my dogs. I was sleeping lightly with my rifle at the ready, and was up at the first sound, getting my first close sight of him as he raised his bloody fangs from the husky's throat and turned to face me. He must have stood nearly 3 feet high, but it was the ghoulish fury in his yellow eyes that unnerved me more than his great stature. I fired point blank at the hideous head, but still he stood there, fixing me with that baleful glare, and it was not until the pack closed in on his flank that he turned and loped away. 3 dogs only are left of my original 5, and these are so demoralized with terror that I can make but poor headway. I, too, own myself a victim of intense nervousness, and am weighted down by an uncanny, unreasonable feeling of dread. If I were more susceptible to superstitious beliefs, I might find myself imagining all sorts of weird explanations of my failure to drop him at point blank with a rifle that has brought down moose. As it is, though I take no stock in werewolf tales, my mental condition is such that I would not be above trying a silver bullet on him if I had one, merely to relieve my nerves. December 7th. The thing was back again last night, but this time he appeared in a different manner. He is bold now, and appeared as soon as dusk had fallen, skulking in the shadows just outside the circle of firelight. 3 hours I sat there under the spell of those hellish yellow eyes, now appearing on one side of the circle, now on the other, compelling me frequently to change my position in order to watch him. I fired again and again with no result except that the eyes moved to another position. Then it happened. Before I knew what had occurred, I was pouring shot after shot into the charging beast, until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He was so close that the hateful eyes seemed burning through my brain, and in desperate agony I grasped the only weapon my hand fell upon, the silver knife. What happened then I do not clearly know, but he swerved away from me, and in some unexplainable way I sensed fear in his snarl. Then he was among the dogs, ripping and slashing, and a third victim was torn to ribbons. My nerve is shattered, and I scarcely know what to believe. Bullets have no effect on the thing, and I am here in the wilderness 100 miles from civilization, with no protection against him. I have one hope, founded on the manner in which he avoided me last night. For some reason he fears me, although I am absolutely helpless before him. My only hope now is to push on to the coast with the 2 dogs I have left, praying that these 2 may not fall victims before I reach there. December 8th. I am writing this now not to dispel loneliness or even nervousness, but in sheer terror, and to take my mind off the horror that is prowling outside. It may be the last page of this ghastly tale, for the thing has grown desperate now, and apparently has submerged its fear of me in the greater fear of my reaching civilization and escaping it. Since early morning I have pushed forward at a killing pace, with the thing growing steadily in confidence or in desperation, and drawing closer to me with every mile. At noon I reached this abandoned miner's cabin, and was able to gain its shelter in just the nick of time. The thing evidently can think, for at sight of the cabin it threw all caution to the winds and charged, straining me to the utmost to reach the door, and forcing me to abandon the dogs. Their cries were pitiful, for so greatly had the terror grown upon them that they did not even try to fight. Watching from a small high window on the north side of the cabin, I was sickened at the savage rending of their bodies, and at the ghastly aspect of its bloody snout as it raised its head and gave vent to a blood-chilling howl, the first sound I have heard it utter. I cannot describe the nightmare of horror that closed down on my brain as it rang through the silence, and which has left me completely unmanned. It was minutes before I could pull myself together enough to make a search of the cabin for any means of defense, and then at last luck smiled and gave me a glimmer of hope. Among a collection of useless odds and ends left by the miners, I found an old bullet mold, and the thought has come to me that I may be able to melt enough silver from the knife to run a bullet. Weird and ridiculous as the idea seems, I'm convinced that the thing outside can be nothing else than a werewolf, and my only hope is to try a silver bullet, to which alone they are said to be vulnerable. I have pried all of the loose wood obtainable off of the studding, and wait now for the fire to burn into coals hot enough to melt the silver. It is almost ready, and I stop now to break a piece from the guard of the knife. All hope of killing the thing is now gone. The wood I have is too dry and lifeless to make a fire hot enough to melt the silver. I must play a waiting game now, for as long as the provisions in my shoulder knapsack hold out, I am safe. In its wolf form, the thing cannot open the door, although I have no way of barring it, and if it assumes human shape, I will kill it with a bullet. It is whining now, and scratching against the wall in an effort to rear up high enough to look in the window. Now it is padding back and forth, before the door, trying doubtless to work up courage to assume its human form, and there now is a hand on the latch. It has been 3 minutes now since the latch was raised. Fear is doubtless holding him back. At any moment he may conquer it, but I am ready. Hounds of hell! Can it be possible that he is changing back into a wolf again? There was a strange look on Inspector Moore's face as he raised his eyes in a questioning glance to the face of the constable, who still waited. "Just how did you come into possession of these?" he asked. Nagel's face showed plainly that he too had perused the contents of the diary. "I found them in an abandoned miner's cabin beyond Bitter Creek," he answered slowly. "Wolf Dahlgren was in there, dead, his throat torn as though by the fangs of a wolf. I found this diary on the table beside him. There was another corpse in there, too, a wrinkled old Indian whose weird ceremonial garb marked him as some kind of medicine man or sachem. It was in his breast that I found the silver knife." If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,